Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 14th lecture in our course on general psychology. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about intelligence. And this will actually be the only lecture on intelligence that I give. This module will consist of just the one lecture and the accompanying slides and practice quizzes. So this is a one lecture unit. So we're going to talk this session about research on intelligence. And intelligence is actually kind of a tricky subject because it can be hard to define. How do we define intelligence? What makes an intelligent person? Who's intelligent and who isn't? How does that depend on context? How does it depend on culture? How does it depend on skills and experience? So it can be difficult to define intelligence in a way that everyone agrees on. And then, of course, once you define it, then you have to actually study it. So how do you measure intelligence and study it in a principled fashion? And then once you've defined it, once you've studied it, uh, how do you determine the causes of intelligence? So say, for example, one person is intelligent and another person isn't. Uh, Once you've got your definitions down and you've established intelligence as a phenomenon, uh, how do you differentiate the cases of those two people? How do you determine what causes one person to be intelligent and the other person not to be, even if you're already comfortable with those definitions? So it's a three-pronged difficulty. And what we're going to do today uh, is first look at that definition problem. And we're going to understand some of the major theories on intelligence. And theories on intelligence have evolved over time. And there's a fair amount of agreement in terms of what tests should be used and what the theoretical background is for intelligence. But we didn't always have a good theory for it. So that's something that had to be developed and had to be added to based on incoming data. And we'll see that intelligence, even though we use that one term, isn't just one thing. It's not one trait that one person is intelligent and one person is not, and that defines uh, whether they can do certain tasks, whether they can remember certain kinds of information, what sort of things they're good at and what things they're not good at. So it's not as binary a distinction as this person is intelligent and this person is not. And we'll also look at some of the determinants of intelligence and what influences intelligence. So there are certainly going to be some genetic components, but intelligence is not entirely genetically defined. There are also a lot of environmental influences that can cause a person to seem or be measured as more or less intelligent. So we'll look at those as well. So first, we have to come up with a definition for intelligence. What is it? And your book uses a pretty good definition, and that is the ability to use one's mind to solve problems, but also to learn from experience. And there we have that word learn. And of course, we spent the last couple of units on learning and on memory. That's why I've placed them in this order. And so the ability to learn from experience is part of intelligence, but intelligence is not the same thing as knowledge. So there's more to intelligence than just the acquisition and memorization of facts. That is a component of some intelligence tests, but it is not all that intelligence is. And so when we look at the history of intelligence research, there are both positives and negatives. There have been some good contributions and some not so good contributions. So the beginnings of principled intelligence research uh, really start with Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. And these were two 19th century French scientists, French psychologists, that were interested in the education of children. So France was going through a lot of social reform at the time, and these two scientists wanted to be able to assess what the educational level was of a given child. And so they came up with a test to assess the so-called mental age of a child. So perhaps the child was chronologically 10 years old. That is, they were 10 years old in a literal sense. They'd experienced 10 birthdays. Uh, but their mental age could be more than that or it could be less than that. And so Binet and Simon realized that age was not always a perfect predictor of intelligence. And if you were going to place a child at a certain educational level, you needed to assess their mental age as well as their physical age. So that was a good contribution. Uh, Henry Goddard represents a not so good contribution. And what Goddard did, he was an American psychologist, and he was interested in assessing really who should be citizens in the United States, even who should be allowed to have children. This gets onto a topic that's called eugenics, which is the idea that by controlling the genes present in the population, that you can make better people, more or less. And so Goddard uh, was interested in assessing certain groups of people as feeble-minded, in his words. And so he was attempting to influence immigration policy. And so one thing he did was label a lot of Eastern European groups as feeble-minded. They either should not be allowed to immigrate or should not be allowed to have children, um, which is unethical for a number of reasons. That also happens to be wrong. Uh, and two things come to light with this historical fact. One is that Goddard was basically using the idea of intelligence to justify existing prejudice. This is a time when Eastern European groups were thought to be less desirable in many ways than Western European groups. And you may not be surprised to learn that Goddard himself was of Western European heritage. And so his prejudice against Eastern Europeans uh, came through in his assessment of their intelligence as a group. Uh, it's also worth noting that it highlights methods that build culture into intelligence. So if you don't know a lot of words in English, perhaps your vocabulary is not so good, but that could be because English is not your first language. It doesn't mean you're not intelligent. It just means you have a different cultural background. And so this is sort of a warning sign when it comes to using knowledge as an equivalent to intelligence. Uh, and it talks about it speaks to the importance of culture and cultural background. That just because someone doesn't know all the things that the intelligent tester does, doesn't mean they're not intelligent. It just means they have a different set of facts at their disposal, especially when it comes to language and fluency in language. So a cautionary tale with Henry Goddard. But then along comes an individual named William Stern. And William Stern very much drew on the tradition of Binet and Simon. And what Stern did was come up with the idea of what we call IQ, an intelligence quotient. And what Stern at first did was use what's called the ratio intelligence quotient. And a ratio, of course, is just the relationship between two numbers. In this case, you take the person's mental age as assessed by an intelligence test, you divide it by their chronological age, and you multiply that by 100. So the fact that you have that division is why it's called a quotient. Quotient is the mathematical result of division. So, for example, if a person is 8 years old mentally, that is, they have an intelligence test result indicating they're mentally 8, but they're chronologically 10 years old, their physical age is 10. Well, then you have 8 divided by 10, which is 0.8, multiply that by 100, and you get an IQ of 80. Of course, you can have a mental age higher than the chronological age. Say you're physically 10, but your mental age is 12. Well, then you would get 1.2, multiply that by 100, you'd have an IQ of 120. So it turns out this works fine for children. It's not a bad assessment method for children. So again, if a child is 10 physically, but they have the mental age of an 8-year-old, uh, then you can use that intelligence quotient using this ratio. There's a problem though, and that is something that led to the development of what's called deviation IQ. And the problem is this. As soon as you're dealing with adults, this division method kind of breaks down. So say you are 20 years old, but you test and have the same ability mentally As a 60-year-old, well, then you'd have an IQ of 300. And that doesn't make much sense. The average 60-year-old is not really three times as intelligent as the average 20-year-old. So that development of intelligence across the lifespan breaks down once you get to adulthood. So the average 15-year-old uh, is more intelligent than the average 10-year-old. But the difference in intelligence between a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old isn't really that big. And so this led to the development of the deviation IQ, in which the person's test score is compared to the average adult's test score. Sometimes it's restricted to an age range. Um, but the point is that you're comparing adults to other adults. You're not assuming that as the person continues to age into adulthood, that they continue to grow more intelligent. So this is an empirical approach, but an empirical approach that doesn't assume that progression of intelligence with age. It's the same mathematical approach, you're just dividing different numbers. And so that is really what is used for adults now, is this comparison of test scores between adults. It's not a comparison of your age to an older adult's age and their mental abilities that go along with that. So we have this definition of IQ that's still in use today. Ratio quotients are really used for children. Deviation IQs are more used for adults. All right, so that's how we describe intelligence. We can describe it in terms of ratio IQ or deviation IQ. But of course, both of those are based on some kind of test score. And the method of testing has changed over time. So it started with Binet and Simon. Later on, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was the development of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale by a psychologist named Wechsler, not surprisingly. And this test, or forms of it, are still in use today. If you've heard the term WASI, that is sometimes a commonly used intelligence test. And it's the shorter version of this test. But this test has a number of components that test different skills, that test different abilities. One of them is verbal comprehension. And so here it's testing things like vocabulary, uh, other language skills. And as I just mentioned, we have to be wary of equating vocabulary with intelligence because of someone's linguistic background. The verbal comprehension component of the test also looks at knowledge, the knowledge of facts. And again, this can depend on someone's education, someone's cultural background. So we have to be a little careful with verbal comprehension and how much it says about intelligence. But it is a component of intelligence because it assesses learning. There are also perceptual reasoning components. So in this figure in the lower right, uh, it has a number of shapes that are formed in a grid, and the person is asked to indicate which shape comes in the empty box. Uh, so this is a pattern recognition test. And there are other ways of assessing it, things like recreating visual puzzles out of blocks and other shapes. So simply recognizing patterns, but also extrapolating patterns, in this case, looking at what comes next in this list of symbols. There are working memory tests. And so here, these are things like how many digits can you hold in mind and repeat back accurately? How good are you at solving simple math problems? Mathematic problems take working memory because you have to manipulate information. You have to keep numbers in mind, but you also have to manipulate them in some way. You have to perform mathematical operations on those numbers. And so that's often used to test working memory. Also, there's processing speed, not just what you know and are you able to manipulate information, but how fast can you process concepts and ideas. And for processing speed, these are timed tests where you're given a symbol, for example, and asked to search for it. So whether you can recognize symbols, how quickly you can process a variety of symbols or stimuli. So that assesses processing speed. And these are all components in this intelligence scale. And this is a scale that's still used. And I'm not going to delve into the individual test components. These are sort of an overview of what kind of thing is tested. But if you aggregate these results into someone's IQ, this test actually has some predictive power to it. You can use these test results uh, to correlate with various life outcomes, and it does so pretty well. So one of the things it correlates with is income. And so this is a figure from your book in the upper right that looks at the income levels of siblings within a family. Uh, and of course, this is aggregated over lots and lots of siblings. But the income level correlates with the IQ of the individual. And the reason they're using siblings here is to control for environment. So siblings tend to share the same environment if they're raised together. And so you can rule out uh, a lot of environmental influence and look at intelligence as a function of income. And so income is correlated with intelligence. And a lot of that boils down to education. So more education tends to be correlated with more income. So it's not just intelligence. Education is built in here as well when we're measuring things out in the real world. Interestingly, health also correlated with outcomes on this test. And so people tend to have less cardiovascular disease. They tend to live longer, in fact, if they have higher scores, higher IQ scores according to this test. Uh, and of course, part of this is going to be driven by income. People with higher incomes tend to have better health outcomes as well. You have more money to spend on your health care. Um, People with higher intelligence also tend to be better at long-term planning, for example. And so being able to weigh the consequences of certain behaviors when it comes to health also seems to be a factor. And so we have more income, we have better health correlated with these tests. Happiness is also correlated with its intelligence result, and that's also going to be correlated with income to a certain degree and health. But it's also true at a national level that countries that have higher average IQs also tend to have higher average happiness. Now, what's really interesting is that higher average intelligence is also correlated with what's called happiness equality. Not just the average level of happiness within the country, but also the amount of disparity in happiness levels within the country. So, for a given country, you might have a high average happiness, but you could have a lot of variability. You could have really happy people and really unhappy people. And that would be a nation with low happiness equality. Whereas if everyone was really pretty equally happy, that would be high happiness equality. And so it's true that the happiness on average of a nation tends to be correlated with average IQ. IQ is also correlated with equality in happiness. So really smart countries, so to speak, um, not only tend to be happier, but everyone tends to be more equal in terms of their happiness. So interesting result on the national level. So that's how we test intelligence. And what have those tests told us about how intelligence is structured? So what is the nature of intelligence? Is it a single general ability? Is intelligence really one thing? Can the world be split into intelligent people and unintelligent people? And the answer there is not really. Uh, it's very rare for somebody to be good at everything. It's also very rare for somebody to be good at nothing at all. And so people come with a mix of abilities and skills. And so it's not really an accurate portrayal of an individual to just say that they're intelligent or not. There are different skills. And now that being said, there have been various theories that do have this kind of general ability built into them. Uh, but they're always qualified saying that there are multiple skills involved. And some of these could be the function of experience. You tend to be more skilled at things that you've done before. But that concept is always there. Spearman, who was another intelligence theorist, recognized fully that while there might be general abilities that he labeled G, sort of a general form of intelligence, there were also specific abilities that he labeled S. Uh, and so again, we go back to this idea that maybe there's a general concept of intelligence, but certainly you can't just boil everything down to intelligent people and not intelligent people. That people have different skills, different abilities, and a lot of that comes from experience. However, a psychologist named Thurstone uh, came along and said, well, you can't, it's not as simple as that. Um, Thurstone, in fact, denied the concept of general abilities, that factor G. Instead, Thurstone said there were a set of primary mental abilities that he labeled M. And this was a powerful theory. Uh, and it turns out that both Spearman and Thurstone were kind of right. Uh, there does seem to be a general intelligence, uh, and there do seem to be specific abilities, certainly, but those abilities can also be grouped into these primary mental abilities that Thurstone came up with. But it took other psychologists, your book doesn't name them, but they are Cattell, Horn, and Carroll, to come up with what's called the three-stratum theory. Your book also doesn't label this theory, but that's its name. And so you have G at the top indicating general intelligence. You also have, in the middle row here of this diagram, the sort of mental abilities, the primary mental abilities of Thurstone. And within those groups, you also have the little S's, those specific abilities. And so Cattell, Horn, and Carroll kind of combined Spearman's ideas and Thurstone's ideas into a theory that is currently widely accepted. So intelligence isn't just one thing, but it's also not just a set of individual skills. There is that general ability G, but there are also groups of skills that can be combined, and there's some predictive power here. Within these groups, M, if you're good at one specific thing, S, you're probably good at the other specific things, S, within that group. And so this is a way of organizing intelligence in a way that matches theory, but also matches data in terms of intelligence testing. So the ideas of Spearman and Thurstone were driven largely by their conception of intelligence. But we see with Cattell, Horn, and Carroll a more mathematical, a more data-driven approach. And so their three-stratum theory was based not on introspection, but was really based on advanced mathematical techniques. And what they did was apply correlations. So I just said on the previous slide that there was the general ability G, there are those middle level, those primary mental abilities M, and there are specific skills. And those skills, S, were put into groups. But they weren't put into groups based on guessing or based on introspection. They were based on correlations between these skills in intelligence tests. So your book uses a fine example of this technique. So for example, if a person is tested on how well they balance teacups and how well they swat flies, how well they understand Shakespeare, and how well they sum numbers together. Well, those are four different skills, and they can be assessed on all four of them. But some of those skills might be more related to one another than other skills. So, not surprisingly, balancing teacups might be more correlated with swatting flies. Those are both physical abilities. They require coordination. And so if someone's good at one of those things, balancing teacups, you might guess that they're good at swatting flies. And the data could bear that out. You could also look at the data and say that, well, this person's good at understanding Shakespeare. They're also good at adding numbers together. And that seems to be true across the population, that if you're good at one of those, you tend to be good at the other. And so you can look at the structure of correlations between different tests. And conversely, you wouldn't expect people that are good at swatting flies to necessarily be good at understanding Shakespeare. So you can compare those test results and see that they're not very correlated. So balancing teacups and swatting flies seem to be part of the same skill that we might call physical coordination. And understanding Shakespeare and adding numbers together might be part of an academic skill. So two different groups that would correspond to those abilities M. Um, and so we're using data here, the test results and the correlations between them, to say which skills belong together in groups. And so this three-stratum theory was built using this data-driven approach. And according to this stratum theory, there are 8 of these mid-level abilities, these primary mental abilities. And they correspond to things like verbal skills, perceptual skills. 2 of them, however, are not so obvious. And one of them is called crystallized intelligence. And what crystallized intelligence is intelligence that's based on experience. So knowing facts, for example, that is a form of crystallized intelligence. So it is experience-based. It is already formed. That is why it's called crystallized. It takes previous experience. The other form is what's called fluid intelligence. And this is the ability to solve problems one has never been confronted with before. So for example, given a pattern of symbols one has never seen, and especially if one has never seen this sort of test at all, you're asked to come up with the next symbol in the sequence. And so that uses fluid intelligence. You haven't studied this before. You haven't taken this test before. You can't use your previous experience, your crystallized intelligence, to solve this problem. You have to use your fluid intelligence to solve new problems. And so those are 2 of those mid-level skills, M, that the three-stratum theory comprises. You also have that general intelligence, G, that speaks to correlations between those primary mental abilities. Now, that being said, all of this data-driven approach is really good at determining what skills belong together, what skills are related to one another. Of course, it's not very good at describing the structure of intelligence for those aspects that aren't tested. And so other theory-based approaches have said, well, wait a minute, these structures, this mathematical approach, is only as good as the data it's given. You can't say anything about untested abilities. And so it has been proposed there are other forms of intelligence as well. So the ability to solve problems in the test that we've been talking about is what composes what's called analytic intelligence. So all that belongs to analytic intelligence. However, it's also been proposed there are things like creative and practical intelligence. So analytic intelligence is the ability to solve a problem that you're presented with. However, life isn't always that easy. It's not always that simple. Sometimes you have to define a problem in the first place. And that's where creative intelligence comes in. So you're not always told what the problem is. You have to create a framework for the problem. You have to decide what is part of this problem, what is the problem that we're trying to solve. So that's creative intelligence. And people high in creative intelligence tend to come up with novel solutions. And that's not something that's really tested in these other intelligence tests, creativity. Another aspect of this theory-driven approach is practical intelligence. So maybe you've defined the problem. Maybe you've got a solution. Well, now you've got to figure out a way to implement that solution. And this comes up in things like engineering problems. If you're given a set of tools, how do you actually implement the solution you want? And so that involves practical intelligence. And people can also be high in practical intelligence and not high in analytic intelligence that's revealed by these tests. So these things are not necessarily equivalent, and creative and practical intelligence are not necessarily tested by things like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. There's also emotional intelligence. And this has become a more popular notion over the years that emotional intelligence is really important. And what emotional intelligence is the ability to interact with other people, to recognize their emotions, to use emotions to make decisions. So recognizing emotions in others, assessing relationships, uh, getting along with other people, and learning how to interact with them. These are all concepts within emotional intelligence. And of course, the tests we've been talking about so far don't build in these ideas. Um, if you're good at solving one of these puzzles shown in the top right, or you're good at balancing teacups, or you're good at adding up numbers, none of these things indicate how good you are in social situations. And social situations are a key part of our existence. And not surprisingly, people that are high in emotional intelligence, that are good at recognizing emotions, and good at using emotions uh, to to inform decisions, they tend to have more satisfactory relationships. They tend to have better work experiences, and so these things are non-trivial. Um, Emotional intelligence can say a lot about your life outcomes. So again, this is another way of looking at intelligence, another way of looking at the set of skills that somebody needs to accomplish goals. Okay, so we can define intelligence. We can devise and implement tests that assess intelligence, and we can use those tests in theory to come up with structures for intelligence. How do different components of intelligence relate to one another? And once we've done all that, the question is, what makes for an intelligent person? Why are some people more intelligent according to these tests, and why are some people less intelligent? Uh, and there are a number of factors that are involved here. And there is an influence of genetics. So, to a certain degree, an individual inherits uh, their level of intelligence from their parents. And we know this from studies involving dizygotic and monozygotic twins. And we talked about twin studies a few lectures ago when we were looking at heritability of traits. Uh, Here, dizygotic means fraternal. So if you know fraternal twins, they are dizygotic. And the reason it's named that is that the zygote is the fertilized egg. And dizygotic twins developed from two separate eggs fertilized by two separate sperm. And so they don't share as much genetic material as monozygotic twins. Monozygotic twins are identical twins, as they're often called, and they are the outcome of a single egg, a single fertilized egg. That egg happened to split into two, but those two split versions contain identical genetic information. So dizygotic twins are more related than monozygotic twins. And by comparing the relationship, the correlation in intelligence between these two different kinds of twins, we can look at how heritable intelligence is. Because these twins are often raised in the same environment, and we can look at how correlated the intelligence scores are for dizygotic versus monozygotic twins. There are other ways of looking at this relationship as well. For example, you can look at identical twins that are raised apart and see how much their intelligences are still related to each other. The answer is a lot. In the end, you can come up with a score for what's called heritability, denoted as h squared. And this is the amount of variation uh, in intelligence between people in a group that can be attributed to genetics. And we think it's somewhere between zero point 0.5 and zero point 0.7. So we have this h squared value between zero point 0.5 and zero point 0.7. We should be careful, though, and not to say that an individual's intelligence is based half or a little more than half on his or her genes. So this is just, first of all, an average across the population. You can't really say for a single individual how much of their intelligence is a result of their genes. Also, populations differ in their heritability. So there's an interplay between genetics and environment. And for some groups, genetics will play a bigger part, especially if they're all in the same environment. If there's not much variability in their environment, then of course a lot of their variability is going to be defined by their genes. Conversely, if you have a really genetically homogeneous population, that is, that there's really not much variation in the group's genes, well, then a lot of that variation has to come from the environment when it comes to intelligence. So we can't say that half a person's intelligence comes from their genes. It's not as simple as that. It's just an average, and it depends on the group you're looking at. And there are influences of environment when it comes to genetics. And this is another way of assessing heritability. And so siblings, especially, often have shared environments, or at least a lot of features that they share. And this is what's referred to as their shared environment. So those features they have in common are shared. Those features they don't have in common are non-shared. So even identical twins seldom have the exact same experiences. And those differences in experience are important. Uh, and it's true even for identical twins. You might think they're in the same environment, but no two twins have exactly the same experiences. They develop different interests, different social groups, uh, and just by random chance they'll have different experiences. Uh, so that's one thing to think about is that these identical twins, even though they're genetically identical, don't share, even if raised together, the same experiences. And it's certainly true for uh, other siblings. They're different ages. So maybe one sibling is home for a certain period, and the other sibling is at home for a different period. There's going to be a lot of overlap probably, but not entire overlap. And so they'll have different experiences. They'll have a bigger non-shared set of features. What's also interesting is that heritability, h squared, has a relationship with age. So for young children, uh, that heritability is really pretty low. So that is to say that the amount of variability between children that's accounted for by genetic factors isn't that big, uh, because they tend to have such widely different environments. So environment plays a bigger role in explaining intelligence at that age. Older adults, however, uh, more of their intelligence differences are attributable to genes because they tend to have more similar environments. Uh, and again, this highlights what heritability can say and what it can't say. So again, if you have a more variable environment between members of a group, that variable environment is going to account for more differences between intelligence. And environment itself has a big influence. So age is an important factor once again. So not just when looking at heritability, like we did in the figure in the upper right, but also just looking at the relationship between age and IQ scores. And IQ does tend to decline, especially as one gets older, reaching the 60s, 70s, 80s. Intelligence tends to decline, and a lot of that we think is attributable to differences and declines in processing speed. Retention of facts can still be quite good. Uh, Language skills, perceptual skills, these things can all be okay. But processing speed and therefore the overall intelligence score tends to decline. You also have what's known as the Flynn effect. And what the Flynn effect is looking not really at age, but looking at different generations. So if you look at test scores for 60-year-olds from 100 years ago and compare them to test scores for 60-year-olds now, uh, later generations tend to have higher IQ scores, both for crystallized and fluid intelligence. And this is interesting. What it says is that newer generations, younger generations, uh, tend to be more intelligent and not just looking at age. We know there are these age effects. But again, if you match for age, looking at the same age groups, later generations tend to have higher intelligence scores. And we think a lot of this has to do with nutrition, for example. People tend to be more well nourished now. It's also education. So our educational methods have improved, but also the amount of information that's conveyed during school has grown. And so all of these things combine, we think, to increase intelligence across generations. And then finally, two big environmental influences are socioeconomic status, often called SES, and education. So socioeconomic status is tied very tightly to income level. And individuals with and families with higher incomes uh, tend to have better nutrition, tend to have more time and more access to education. And the way that parents interact with their children tends to differ based on socioeconomic status. Things like the number of words that are given to children, that are used in front of children, correlates with higher SES. So more words, children tend to experience more words as they're developing in higher SES families. Um, the sorts of questions, the sorts of conversations that take place uh, tend to be more stimulating. And again, this is tied to education with higher SES versus lower SES groups. Uh, and so education is also tied to SES. Higher SES groups can afford more education. And there's sort of a feedback mechanism here. So people with higher SES tend to afford more education, pay for more education. And as we've already discovered, more education tends to lead to higher income. So high SES tends to lead to more education. More education tends to lead to high SES. Uh, and so education is a big factor in determining intelligence. All right. So those are some factors that seem to determine or play a large part in intelligence. So we have genetic factors, we have environmental factors like socioeconomic status and education level, but there is variation in intelligence across the population that doesn't depend on those factors. So if you look at IQ scores, they follow what is called a normal distribution. Now, the way the IQ is defined, because it's relative to the average adult's test score, uh, the average person has an IQ score of 100. So that's the mean. And of course, the mean normal and the normal distribution are concepts we talked about in our unit on psychological methods. However, there's also the variability, how wide that curve is, how widely distributed intelligence scores are. And there's an interesting relationship between variability in intelligence and the sex of the individual. So the averages don't seem to differ between men and women. However, men tend to have more variability in their intelligence. What does that mean? Well, it means that that curve is narrow for women and wide for men. So you have more men on the low end of the scale than you do women, as well as the high end of the scale. So it's not about the average intelligence of the groups concerned, it's about the variability. Uh, and when it comes to individual components of intelligence tests, there are differences between the sexes. So women tend to score higher on verbal comprehension, fluency, so a lot of verbal skills. Men tend to score high on spatial skills. And there's a debate as to whether those are genetically based differences or whether those are environmentally based differences. And we don't know. And the reason we don't know is that men and women are treated differently in virtually every culture. Uh, and so there's an interesting experiment that shows that people, if they think an infant is female, will talk to the infant more. And so that infant obviously will have more experience using verbal skills and using verbal comprehension. And of course, boys and girls are given different kinds of toys to play with. Expectations for the behavior is different. Uh, and all these things can combine to inform different skills. So it's not surprising that women and men develop different aptitudes, different skills, and therefore score differently on intelligence tests because their development is so different. And maybe at some point in the future that won't be true anymore. Uh, but for right now, we cannot separate the influence of genetics and environment because both differ between women and men. Intelligence is also negatively correlated with mental illness. So more intelligent individuals tend to have a lower incidence of mental illness. And this kind of flies in the face of our notion of the unbalanced genius. Um, so perhaps you've seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, where you have a very intelligent individual who also has schizophrenia. Or you may have heard the idea that a lot of artists have bipolar disorder. However, higher skills on intelligence tests, higher intelligence scores, are actually negatively correlated with mental illness. And so as IQ goes up, the risk of mental illness actually goes down. There are also, of course, differences between groups. Uh, and this can be a touchy subject because if you're looking especially at differences between ethnic groups, uh, we have to be wary of assuming that is a genetic difference. So are there differences between groups? Yes. Are these differences genetic? We don't have a reason to think so. In fact, there's evidence that it's not genetically based. And so early psychologists like Henry Goddard, of course, assumed that differences between groups were due to genetic superiority or inferiority. However, there's really not evidence for that, and in fact, there's evidence against it. Uh, and so what that gives us is the idea that these are really environmental influences. So different ethnic groups can vary in terms of socioeconomic status. They can vary in terms of cultural background. And both of those things can have a big impact on scores and intelligence tests. At the beginning of the field of intelligence testing, tests were often culturally biased. They asked about knowledge that might be common in one culture and not in another. Or they asked about behaviors that might differ from one culture to another. And so when it comes to social behavior, what is the right answer? And so early intelligence tests had these problems. Later intelligence tests, modern ones, have tried to eliminate these problems and done a pretty good job of it. Have they been entirely eliminated? Probably not. Uh, but they are at least sensitive to those cultural differences between groups when it comes to background knowledge. And so environment plays a big role here. There's also the role of expectation. And so this gets to what is called stereotype threat. And this is where if a person is reminded, if they have in mind uh, their group membership, it can affect their performance on intelligence tests. Uh, and so if there's a stereotype about your group doing either well or poorly on an intelligence test, your performance tends to match that expectation. And the most famous test here, the most famous experiment, uh, was with Asian women taking intelligence tests, in particular, taking mathematical tests. And so if the Asian women were reminded that they were female right before the test, uh, that they were given cues that primed them as to their femaleness, then they tended to do worse because there's a stereotype, however unfounded, that women are not as good at math. And so they were reminded of that stereotype, and their behavior conformed to that stereotype. However, when the same group, Asian women, were primed on their Asianness, they performed better on the mathematical test. Why? Well, because there's a stereotype that Asian individuals are good at math. And so you have the same group, and their performance differs based on what stereotype they have in mind. So that is obviously a factor when it comes to cultural upbringing and intelligence, and expectation has a role to play in the outcome of intelligence testing. Now, all this difference between different groups, whether it's sex or ethnicity or culture, um, these differences exist But we can also do things to increase intelligence for an individual, again, on average. There are educational interventions. So enrolling someone in preschool or kindergarten tends to increase IQ. Nutrition can increase IQ by, all these things increase IQ by a few points. So the quality of the food someone eats, especially early on in development. So nutrition has a very big impact on brain development during early childhood and infancy. So all these things can be done, can be worked on to increase intelligence, especially during childhood. Okay, that will do it for our lecture on intelligence. Again, this is the only lecture in this unit. So next time we will start an entirely new unit. We will learn about emotion and motivation. And first we'll talk about what an emotion is. How do we define it? As well as theories of emotion. How many emotions are there? How do we group them together? What are they based on? We'll look at emotion and the brain. So how does brain function, neural activity, and brain structure come to influence and give rise to emotions? We'll also look at emotion-based behavior. How consistent is behavior across emotional states? What sort of behaviors do people tend to exhibit in a given emotional state? And then finally, we'll look at motivation. What drives behavior? Why do people behave the way they do? And so we'll look at all of that in our next unit, and I will see you then.